On his son's wedding day, everything was supposed to be perfect, until he saw the name card, not father of the groom, but undereducated fake dad. Laughter echoed, especially from the bride's wealthy family. But the son noticed, and without hesitation, walked out with his father. This isn't a story of humiliation. It's a story about what it means to be a real father. A single dad who raised his boy with calloused hands and sleepless nights, stood tall against a family that had everything, except a heart. The past resurfaces, custody battles, silent sacrifices, and the quiet fear of never being enough. Then comes the twist. The mighty family's empire collapses, and the father had more to do with it than anyone guessed. From the ashes, the son finds true love, builds a business, and creates the kind of life money can't buy. And the father? He sits on the porch, beer in hand, knowing he got it right. Because fatherhood isn't a title. It's a choice, made over and over again, every single day. They laughed at him. In the end, he was the one still standing. Stick with us to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe. Ah, yes. That very day. The day that was supposed to be the happiest of my life. Not exactly mine, of course, but my son Mason's wedding. For years, I'd pictured that moment, standing proudly in the back of the hall, watching him start a new life with the person he loved. Hundreds of times I'd painted that scene in my mind. Maybe I'd shed a few tears, maybe laugh a lot, or maybe just stand there and applaud until my hands went numb. But none of those daydreams prepared me for what I saw that day. The ceremony was held in the opulent ballroom of a downtown hotel, the kind of place where chandeliers sparkled like stars and the marble floors looked like they cost more than my old pickup truck. I wasn't used to such fancy places, but I put on my best black suit, the same one I wore to Mason's college graduation. I even shined my boots, hiding all the scuffs, so no one could say I hadn't tried. For a moment, I froze, taking a deep breath, convincing myself that I belonged there because I was Mason's father, and that meant something. I was led to my seat in the first row, as family should be. On the chair lay a small folded card, just like the others. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, too busy trying not to trip over the expensive carpet. But when I finally leaned down to look, my heart stopped. The name on the card wasn't Mr. Daniel Cooper, as it should have been, and not even father of the groom. No, it was something else, something that seared itself onto my chest so fiercely that I could barely breathe. Undereducated fake dad. At first, I thought it was a mistake, a cruel joke, maybe. I looked around thinking someone would rush over, apologize, replace the card with the correct one, but no one came. And then I heard laughter. At first, it was quiet, as if someone was trying to hide it behind their hand, but it grew louder, meaner. When I raised my eyes, I saw them. Claire's family, the Whitmores. Her mother, Judith, was trying to cover her mouth, laughing. Her father, Dr. Richard Whitmore, was smirking as if he'd just seen a dog in a tuxedo. My ears burned, my palms sweated. I looked at Mason, standing by the altar, adjusting his cufflinks. He hadn't seen it yet. Thank God, he hadn't seen it yet. Slowly, I stood up. My first instinct was to leave, to get out of there before Mason noticed, before anyone else could point and laugh. My legs felt heavy, as if they didn't want to move, but I forced them to take a step away from that terrible little card. I reached the middle of the side door when I heard a voice, sharp and clear, above the murmur, "Dad, wait!" I stopped. I turned around, and there he was. Mason was running down the aisle towards me, the tails of his navy blue suit flapping behind him. His face was red, not with embarrassment, but with anger. Real anger, the kind I hadn't seen since he was a teenager and someone tried to steal his bike. He caught up to me and grabbed my arm, squeezing it tightly. His voice trembled slightly as he said, "Dad, let's go home." For a second, I just stared at him, too stunned to speak. I could feel every eye in the room on us, waiting to see what would happen next. But when I looked into Mason's face, into those familiar brown eyes that had once looked up at me from a crib, I knew what I had to do. I nodded. Together, we turned our backs on the ceremony, on the polished floors, on the sparkling chandeliers, on the people who thought they were better than us. I heard whispers and gasps behind us, but I didn't care. Neither did Mason. His hand was firm on my shoulder, as if shielding me from every poisonous glance in the room. Passing through the heavy double doors, I caught a glimpse of Claire, frozen at the altar, her white dress shimmering under the lights. Her mouth was open in shock. Judith's face was contorted in something ugly, and Dr. Whitmore looked like he'd swallowed a lemon. Good. Let them feel what it's like to lose something precious. Outside, the sun was blinding. I blinked a few times, trying to adjust. Mason walked a few steps ahead, his jaw so tight I thought he might crack a tooth. We didn't say a word until we reached the parking lot. I fumbled clumsily with my keys for a second, my hands still shaking, but Mason gently took them from me. "I'll drive, Dad," he said. I got into the passenger seat, feeling like I was moving through water, heavy and slow. As Mason pulled out of the parking lot, I looked out the window, trying to gather my thoughts. I should have felt humiliated. I should have felt crushed. And partly I did. But there was another part, a bigger, stronger part, that felt something entirely different. Pride. Mason could have ignored it. He could have let them laugh and continued with his perfect little wedding. But he didn't. He chose me. He chose respect over appearances, loyalty over show. He chose love. We drove in silence for a long time, the city passing by in blurred streaks of glass and metal. My mind kept going back to that name card. Ugly black letters printed so neatly and boldly. Undereducated fake dad. That's how they saw me. Not as a man who worked 2 jobs to pay the bills. Not as a father who learned to braid clumsy pigtails with awkward fingers when Mason wanted to dress up as a superhero with a cape. Not as the man who stayed up nights when Mason had pneumonia, praying to a god he wasn't even sure existed. No, just some fool to be laughed at. Mason tapped his fingers lightly on the steering wheel. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I should have seen this coming. I should have known." "You couldn't have known," I said, my throat dry, but I forced the words out. "And you were there. That's all that matters." He glanced at me, and for the first time all day he smiled. It wasn't a big smile, but it was real. And it reminded me of all the other smiles over the years, the gap-toothed grins, the guilty teenage smirks, the proud smile on graduation day, the smiles of the boy I raised. We didn't go straight home. Instead, Mason turned towards the old diner on 4th Street, the one we used to go to after Little League games. It was almost empty, just a few tired truckers and a waitress wiping down the counters. We sat in a booth by the window. Mason ordered coffee, I ordered pie. We didn't talk much, and we didn't need to. The world outside kept spinning. The Whitmores were probably frantically trying to explain why the groom had walked out of his own wedding. Maybe they were still laughing at me. Maybe they were cursing me. I didn't care. I had my son. I had a love that no diplomas could buy and no cruel words could break. For the first time all day, sitting in that old vinyl booth, I felt a sense of peace. Let them call me what they wanted. I knew who I was. I was his father. And that was enough. The drive home from the diner was quiet, but not heavy. There was a stillness between us, the kind that comes only after the worst has happened and you realize you're still standing. As we pulled up to our little house on Maple Lane, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The porch light flickered, as always. The paint on the fence was peeling, and the lawn desperately needed mowing. But to me, it was the most beautiful sight in the world. Mason got out first, opening the door as he had thousands of times growing up. I followed slowly, my legs stiff from sitting for so long. The house smelled of old leather and coffee, comfortable, familiar smells. Mason tossed his keys on the hall table, shrugged off his jacket, and turned to me with a look I hadn't seen in years. It wasn't embarrassment, it wasn't anger. It was sadness, pure and deep. "I didn't want today to turn out like this," he said quietly. I shook my head. "You didn't do anything wrong." He sank heavily onto the old couch, the one we'd patched more times than I could count. I sat across from him in the rocking chair that had been my throne for nearly 2 decades. The same chair where I'd read Mason bedtime stories when he was little. The same chair where I'd waited up for him when he was 15 and out past curfew. Memories flooded in, unbidden but welcome. I remembered the nights we'd spent on that couch when the power went out, wrapped in blankets, eating cold beans from a can and laughing like it was an adventure. I remembered Mason, maybe 8 years old, vowing he'd grow up rich and buy me a real leather rocking chair, one that didn't creak when you leaned back. He'd promised. I'd told him I liked the creak. It reminded me the chair was alive, just like our house. I smiled at the memory, and for the first time all evening, the weight on my chest eased a little. Mason leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "Did you ever think maybe I should have married someone simpler? Someone who didn't have a family like that?" I let the question hang in the air. It wasn't my place to tell him who to love. Love wasn't logic. It wasn't a checklist you could neatly tick off. It was messy, complicated, stubborn. I knew that better than most. Instead of answering right away, I stood up and went into the kitchen. I pulled 2 beers from the fridge. Cheap ones, the kind we usually shared on Saturday nights after working on the truck, and handed one to Mason. He took it with a small smile. "You loved her," I said finally, settling back into my chair. "You don't choose where your heart goes. You just hope it goes somewhere good." Mason nodded slowly, staring at the floor. "I thought Claire was different. I thought she loved me for who I was, not for how much I could impress her family." I took a swig of my beer. It was bitter, sharp, familiar. Maybe she did. But love ain't just words, son. It's actions. It's who stands beside you when everything falls apart. He looked up at me, his eyes a little wetter than before. "You've always been there. Always will be." The clock on the wall ticked loudly. Somewhere outside, a dog barked, and a car rumbled down the street. Life went on, even when your heart felt like it had frozen in place. I thought back to the years that had led us here, all the moments that had built the bond between us. Scraped knees and broken toys, parent-teacher conferences where the teachers looked at me like I was some kind of oddity because I didn't use fancy words or wear ironed suits. Nights when Mason had the flu and I slept on the floor next to his bed, just to be close if he needed me. Days when I barely had enough money for bread, but Mason still had lunch money. I wasn't perfect. I made mistakes. I lost my temper sometimes. I missed a few school plays when I couldn't get time off work. But I never missed the important things. Birthdays, graduations, every milestone. And no matter what anyone said about my education or my bank account, no one could ever take that away from me. "Remember," I said, leaning back with a slight creak, "that time you broke your arm playing football in the yard?" Mason chuckled. "Yeah. I thought you were going to kill me." "I thought you were going to kill me," I said, laughing. "You were screaming so loud the neighbor came running over with a baseball bat, thinking we were being robbed." Mason laughed harder, the tension easing from his shoulders. "You carried me 2 blocks to the truck. I was heavy back then. You were even heavier because you wouldn't stop crying." We both laughed, the sound filling the small room like sunlight breaking through a storm. For a little while, we weren't a father and son who had just walked out of a ruined wedding. We were just 2 stubborn souls, battered but not broken, clinging to the one thing that had never failed us, each other. Later that night, after Mason had fallen asleep in his old room, I sat on the porch with another beer, watching the stars flicker. The air was cool, hinting at the coming autumn. I rocked slowly in the old chair, listening to the night sounds, the chirping of crickets, the distant hum of traffic, the creak of the old wood beneath me. I thought about Claire's parents, all their money, their degrees, their polished words. None of it had taught them kindness, none of it had taught them respect. They had everything a man could want, except the one thing that mattered most: a heart. And maybe the world had a funny way of balancing things out. I didn't know then what would happen next. I didn't know about the news that would break the following morning, or how the very people who had laughed at me would become the laughingstock of the town. But in that moment, sitting on my porch, wrapped in the night like an old blanket, I knew one thing for sure. I had already won. I had raised a good man, and no insult, no name tag, no cruel laughter could ever take that victory away from me. I took a long swig of my beer and tilted my head back, smiling at the stars. Let the world think what it wanted. I knew the truth, and so did my son. There's a certain kind of fight that lives deep inside you when you're a man who's had to claw his way through life with calloused hands and stubborn grit. I never planned on being a single father. Nobody plans for that kind of thing. Laura and I thought we had forever. She was smarter than both of us, with dreams that stretched beyond our small town. When she got sick, it felt like the world tilted on its axis, and no matter how hard I tried to right it, it never quite went back to the way it was. After she was gone, it was just me and Mason. 24 years old, a mortgage I could barely afford, a little boy who cried for his mother every night, and a hole in my chest so big I didn't think it would ever close. People whispered about me back then. I heard them in the grocery store when they thought I wasn't listening. Poor guy. He doesn't stand a chance. Daniel Cooper will ruin that boy. He should just give the kid to Laura's parents. They have money, education, a real home. Laura's parents, they didn't waste any time. 2 weeks after the funeral, they showed up on my doorstep with a lawyer and a petition for custody. I can still see them standing on that porch, Mason clinging to my jeans, staring up at Laura's mother with her perfect hair and eyes as sharp as glass. She looked at me like I was something she'd found stuck to the bottom of her shoe. "Be reasonable, Daniel," she said, like she was offering me a deal instead of trying to steal my whole world. "You can't raise him alone. He needs better." I didn't say much. Never been one for fancy speeches. I just said no. Plain and simple. They didn't listen. They sued me 3 times, trying to paint me as an unfit father because I didn't finish high school, because I worked with my hands, because my house was small, and my wallet even smaller. I'll never forget the feeling of sitting in that courtroom, wearing the only tie I owned, listening to their lawyer talk about me like I wasn't even there, like I was just an obstacle between them and what they wanted. They had charts and experts and photographs. I had calloused hands, bloodshot eyes from sleepless nights, and the desperate love of a man who had lost everything except his boy. On paper, it should have been a slaughter. I didn't stand a chance. But sometimes, God sends you an angel in the ugliest of battles. Her name was Julian Price, a court-appointed lawyer, fresh out of law school. She looked like she should still be taking exams, not arguing in front of a judge. But she fought for me like I was her own son. She dragged out every dirty trick the Holloways tried to pull. She showed the court what they really cared about: control, not love. The day the judge ruled in my favor, Mason was curled up in my lap, playing with my work boots. I didn't even hear the first part of the verdict. All I heard was the important part: full custody granted to Mr. Daniel Cooper. I cried right there in the courtroom. Couldn't help it. Ugly, gasping sobs that I tried to swallow but couldn't. Julian just patted me awkwardly on the back and said, "You deserved this. Don't let anyone tell you different." From that day on, Mason was mine to raise, mine to protect. Every scraped knee, every spelling test, every Christmas morning where there were barely enough presents under the tree, but it still felt like magic. I gave him everything I had. Sometimes, late at night when he was little, I'd sit by his bed and just watch him breathe. I was so afraid of messing it up, of not being enough, of maybe the Holloways being right, and me not being good enough. But every morning when Mason woke up and smiled at me with his gap-toothed grin, I told myself I could do this. And I did. Not perfectly, not by any fancy parenting book, but by the only standard that mattered. Being there, staying there, loving without limits. He grew up, and the world didn't always get kinder. Teachers who looked down their noses when I showed up for conferences in my grease-stained boots. Other parents who invited Mason to birthday parties but not me to the barbecues. Sometimes it stung more than I wanted to admit. But Mason never seemed to notice. He'd come home from school, talking about kids whose parents had PhDs or fancy titles, and I'd brace myself for the day he'd start to resent not having a better father. But that day never came. Instead, he'd say, "Dad, you're the smartest man I know. You can fix anything." And he meant it. Not because I could solve algebraic equations or negotiate business deals, but because he trusted that when he needed me, I'd always be there. When Mason turned 15, I sat him down and told him about the custody battle, told him how close I came to losing him. I figured he deserved to know. I expected anger, maybe sadness, but he just sat quietly, and then he hugged me so tight I thought my ribs would crack. "You didn't lose me, Dad," he said. "You never will." Now, sitting on the porch all these years later, those words came back to me, clear as a bell. After everything, the name tag, the laughter, the humiliation, nothing could touch that bond. They didn't know the battles we had fought together. They didn't know the nights we'd spent wrapped in our stubborn love. They saw an uneducated mechanic. They didn't see the man who had rebuilt a whole world with 2 calloused hands and a heart that refused to quit. I closed my eyes, letting the cool breeze wash over me. Mason was asleep inside, safe under the same roof that had sheltered him from scraped knees, broken hearts, and teenage rebellions. My boy. My pride. My proof that love didn't need degrees or pedigrees to be real. Tomorrow, the world would keep spinning. Maybe it would bring more trouble, maybe surprises. But tonight, in the quiet darkness of our little corner of the world, I knew one thing for sure. I had chosen to fight for Mason when it mattered most, and I would choose it again 1,000 times over, because in the end, love wasn't measured by the letters after your name. It was measured by the hands that picked you up when you fell, the arms that carried you home when you couldn't walk, the heart that never stopped believing you were worth something. And by that measure, I was the richest man in the world. There's a certain kind of pride that comes from building something with your own 2 hands, even when nobody else sees it. Our life wasn't made of fancy things, but it was real. Every crack in the wall, every squeaky step on the stairs, every mismatched plate in the kitchen cabinets told a story. A story of survival, a story of laughter when there wasn't much to laugh about, a story of building a life that was ours. After the custody fight, I worked 2 jobs, the factory during the day, fixing trucks at a neighbor's garage at night. Sometimes I'd crawl into bed at 2 in the morning, too tired to even take off my boots. But when Mason would pad into my room in his pajama pants and climb into bed, snuggling close with a sleepy, "Love you, Dad," every aching muscle felt worth it. I didn't know much about raising a kid, right? I never had a manual. No one showed me how. My own father had been gone a long time before I was even a teenager. Half the time I was just guessing, learning as I went. When Mason had colic and cried for hours, I'd walk our small living room, humming off-key lullabies until he finally drifted off. When he got older and asked why his mom wasn't around like the other kids' moms, I'd sit him down and tell him the truth the only way I knew how, gently and simply. "She loved you more than anything in the world," I'd say, stroking his back as he looked up at me with teary eyes. "And she watches over you every day. You were the best thing that ever happened to her." He believed me. And maybe in some way that belief kept both of us going. Money was tight in those years, real tight. There were days I skipped dinner so Mason would have enough to eat. Nights when the electric company threatened to shut off our power. I learned how to stretch $1 until it screamed. Hand-me-down clothes, thrift store toys, school supplies bought late when they were on clearance. But you know what's funny? Mason never complained. Not when he had to wear sneakers with duct tape on the toes. Not when Christmas meant just one present under the tree. Not when his friends had video games and new bikes, and he had a football we patched with shoe glue. He made me prouder than I can even explain. He worked hard in school. He was kind. He helped the neighbors rake leaves and shovel snow without being asked. And every time he came running home sweaty and dirty from playing outside, yelling, "Dad, guess what?" like I was the only person in the bay world he wanted to tell, I knew we were doing okay. We didn't have a big backyard, but we had just enough room for an old wobbly grill and 2 lawn chairs. Every summer, I'd save up for a small camping trip, just me and Mason and a tent that leaked when it rained. We'd fish in muddy rivers, burn marshmallows until they were black, and tell ghost stories that made us both laugh so hard they weren't scary anymore. Those weekends were messy and cheap and perfect. One night, Mason must have been 10 or so. We were lying under the stars, looking up at the sky. He rolled onto his side and looked at me with a seriousness that didn't quite match his missing front teeth. "Dad," he asked, "are we poor?" That question hit me harder than any punch. I wanted to lie, wanted to tell him we were just like everyone else, but I didn't want to build our life on a lie. I thought for a second and said, "We don't have a lot of money, but we're rich in the things that really matter." He frowned, confused. "Like what?" "Like love, like laughter, like always having someone who's got your back." He nodded thoughtfully, like he was tucking that answer away somewhere deep inside him. Then he grinned, crooked and bright. "Then we're the richest people in the world." I laughed so hard that night I probably scared half the wildlife in the woods. Time marched on faster than I wanted it to. Mason got taller, smarter, more thoughtful. He never made me feel dumb for not knowing the things they taught him in school. Instead, he'd come home and patiently explain algebra and history and science experiments that half the time ended with the kitchen smelling like burnt sugar. When he got into college, on a full scholarship no less, I stood in the driveway on his move-in day, pretending I wasn't wiping my eyes with my sleeve. He hugged me so hard my ribs ached. "I'll make you proud, Dad," he whispered. "You already have," I choked out. The house felt empty without him, but I didn't sit around. I fixed up the old motorcycle I'd been meaning to get running, started volunteering at the local youth center, teaching kids how to fix engines. It felt good to give back a little, to share what I knew. Every Sunday, like clockwork, Mason would call. Sometimes from his dorm room, sometimes from the library, once from a rainy street corner because his umbrella broke, and he wanted to tell me he aced his chemistry exam. No matter how busy he was, he never forgot where he came from. And then, years later, came the call with the shaky, excited voice. "Dad," he gasped. "I met her. Claire." At first, I was just happy he was happy. She sounded nice, polite, pleasant. Maybe a little formal, but love smooths out the rough edges, right? I didn't think much of it when Mason mentioned her parents were a little proper. Figured they'd warm up once they got to know us. I didn't understand then how invisible they considered people like me, how much less than they thought we were, something to be tolerated at best, humiliated at worst. Maybe I should have seen it coming, but love makes you believe in the best, even when the warning signs are flashing. And yet, whatever happened at that fancy wedding, whatever bitter laughter tried to rewrite our story, it couldn't erase the life we had built together. A life forged in hard work and even harder love. A life built with calloused hands, stubborn hearts, and a bond that sneers couldn't even scratch. I leaned back in my chair that night, listening to Mason's quiet breathing through the thin walls of the house, and smiled. They thought they could measure a man by his clothes or what university he went to. They had no idea how truly rich we were. Not once growing up did Mason ever make me feel ashamed of who I was. Not once. Even when other kids bragged about their parents being lawyers or doctors or business owners, Mason would puff out his chest and tell anyone who would listen, My dad can fix anything. He said it like it was the most important job in the world. And to him, maybe it was. As he got older, I worried things would change, that teenage years and peer pressure would make him see the grease under my fingernails or the oil stains on my jeans as something to be embarrassed about. I honestly braced myself for it, waited for the day he'd stop inviting me to career days or hesitate when people asked what his father did. But that day never came. Instead, I remember this one time. It was career day at his high school. Kids brought in their parents to talk about their jobs. There were engineers and architects and professors with fancy titles and words fancier than I could understand. I almost told Mason he should pick someone else, someone better to stand up there with him that day. I didn't want to embarrass him, but he wouldn't hear of it. "You're coming, Dad," he said firmly. "You're the smartest man I know." So I went. Wore my best jeans, a clean work shirt, even slicked my hair back the way Mason used to when we played dress-up when he was a kid. I stood beside him as he introduced me to his classmates and teachers. "This is my dad," he said, his voice full of pride. "He's a mechanic. He can fix cars, trucks, lawnmowers, anything with an engine. He even built me a go-kart from scratch when I was 10. The kids' faces lit up. Some of the teachers smiled politely, but some genuinely looked impressed when Mason told them how we used scrap parts and still got that little go-kart running like a dream. Driving home that night, Mason leaned over and said, "Some dads wear suits, but mine can build things with his hands. That's way cooler." I don't think he ever understood what that meant to me. Maybe he never will. Even when he went off to college, surrounded by kids from wealthy families with shiny pedigrees, he never stopped being proud of where he came from. He'd send pictures from his dorm room, grinning like a fool, with a poster of a classic Mustang in the background, the same kind of car we'd spent one long, hot summer rebuilding together. Once, during his sophomore year, he brought a few friends home for a weekend. I worried what they'd think of our small house, the cracked driveway, the mismatched furniture. But Mason acted like it was a palace. He showed them the shed in the backyard where we'd spent countless weekends, told stories about learning to change oil before he learned to drive. He even pointed out my old rocking chair in the living room with a grin and said, "Best seat in the house. Heard all my dad's crazy stories sitting right there." And when one of his friends made a joke about the tiny kitchen, Mason just laughed and said, "Yeah, but you've never had a better burger than my dad's." He made me feel 10 feet tall. That's what love does. It doesn't hide you in the shadows. It shines a light on you, even when the rest of the world looks away. Claire came into his life not long after that. I could tell right away he was head over heels. He talked about her like she was made of sunlight, smart, top of her class, aiming for a career in international law. Mason couldn't stop smiling when he mentioned her name. When I met her for the first time, she was polite, a little reserved, but nice enough. I chalked it up to nerves. Not everyone knows what to say to a man who makes a living elbow-deep in engines. Her smile was tight, her words careful, like she was afraid of getting grease on her just by standing next to me. But Mason looked at her like she hung the moon, and that was enough for me. It was only later, at family gatherings and dinners, that I started to notice the little cracks. The way her parents would talk over me at the table, using words designed to confuse or belittle. The way Claire would sometimes wince when I mentioned work, like I'd said something vulgar. The way she once introduced me to her friends, not as Mason's father, but as the man who fixed their car. And still, I told myself it didn't matter. Maybe I wasn't their kind of people. Maybe they just needed time. Maybe love would smooth things over like it always had before. But looking back now, after what happened at the wedding, I realize that love isn't always enough to bridge certain gaps, especially the ones built out of pride and prejudice. I remember one particular conversation with Mason, maybe 6 months before the wedding. We were fixing the porch swing, replacing some rotted planks. He was hammering nails, and I was holding the new wood steady. "Do you think Claire's parents like me?" he asked suddenly. I shrugged, choosing my words carefully. "They don't know you like I do. Give them time. He nodded, but the crease between his eyebrows didn't disappear. Sometimes I feel like they see me as, I don't know, not good enough, he mumbled, more to the nails than to me. I lowered the plank and wiped my hands on my jeans. Listen, son, I said carefully. Some people are born thinking they're better than others because of where they went to school or how many zeros are in their bank account. That's their problem, not yours. A man is judged by how he treats those who can't do anything for him, by his heart, not his wallet. Mason was silent for a long time, continuing to hammer the nails, but his jaw was tight, and I saw him tuck those words away, the way he always did, when something mattered. Maybe that's why, on his wedding day, when he saw that awful name card and heard the laughter, he didn't hesitate. He remembered what was truly important. He chose love over appearances. He chose respect over status. He chose me. Not because I was a perfect father, not because I had wealth or titles, but because when everything else was stripped away, the money, the education, the fancy suits and big houses, what was left was a bond built on years of late nights, early mornings, scraped knees, burnt dinners, fixed engines, bedtime stories, and 1,000 small moments of just being there. And sometimes that's more than enough. Sometimes that's everything. The Whitmores were the kind of family who wore their pride like armor. Everything about them was polished, rehearsed, a little too perfect. From the first time I met them at some fancy dinner party Claire's parents threw, I felt the difference. They spoke in clipped, precise tones, like every word was a carefully chosen performance. Their handshakes were too firm, their smiles too tight, and when they talked about their achievements, their degrees, their investments, their business ventures, it wasn't a conversation, it was a competition. I tried to fit in, God knows I tried. I wore the best clothes I could afford, kept my elbows off the table, watched my manners the way Laura had taught me all those years ago. I smiled when they dropped fancy terms about stocks and private equity. I nodded politely when Dr. Whitmore boasted about the prestigious universities in their lineage, like it was a crown he wore. But no matter what I did, it wasn't enough. They didn't see the man who had raised a son through blood, sweat, and broken dreams. They didn't see the father who had stayed up nights nursing a sick child, who had learned to braid pigtails for school plays, who had taught a boy to ride a bike, running alongside him for hours even when his legs screamed. They didn't see the love. They saw the grease under my fingernails and the high school dropout. They saw someone they were ashamed to have at their cocktail parties or mention in conversations with their ivory tower friends. And yet, I bit my tongue for Mason's sake. I smiled through gritted teeth. I laughed at their condescending jokes and swallowed my pride like a bitter pill because Mason was happy, because I believed, foolishly maybe, that this marriage would build bridges where words had failed. The weeks leading up to the wedding were filled with little signs. Claire gently suggesting I buy a new suit, something more appropriate for the venue. Judith Whitmore offering to hire a speech coach if I wanted to say a few words at the reception, her tone dripping with a saccharine sweetness that barely masked the insult. Dr. Whitmore mailing me a book on etiquette with a note that read, "A little light, reading before the big day." I could have gotten angry. God knows the younger version of me would have thrown those words right back in their faces. But years of raising Mason had taught me patience, had taught me to choose my battles. I wasn't going to make a scene and embarrass Mason at his own wedding, so I tucked my resentment deep down. I smiled through tight lips. I told myself that one day, when Mason had a family of his own, when he held his own child in his arms, he would understand that sometimes love meant swallowing your pride so your kids could have their day. I wore the new suit. Stiff and uncomfortable, it felt like a costume, not clothes. I practiced my manners. I sat quietly through endless dinners where they discussed vacations I could never afford and schools I could never dream of attending. I endured it all for Mason. The morning of the wedding, I woke up early. too early. I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, watching the sunrise paint the sky. I thought about Laura, how proud she would have been. I thought about the little boy who used to climb into my bed after nightmares, and how he was now a grown man about to start his own life. I told myself that today was Mason's day, not mine, not the Whitmores. I shoved my hands in the pockets of my new suit and whispered to the empty kitchen, "You did good, Laura. We did good." I drove to the venue with a knot in my stomach. The ballroom was grander than I had imagined. Sparkling chandeliers, gilded walls, music drifting through the air like perfume. Guests in tuxedos and silk dresses floated around like it was some kind of royal ball. I felt like a bull who had wandered into a china shop. And yet, I smiled. I shook hands. I let Judith kiss me on the cheek and pretended not to notice her wiping her hand on her dress immediately afterward. I even chuckled at Dr. Whitmore's jokes, even though every word dripped with condescension. And then came the moment that shattered everything. I walked to my assigned seat, trying to ignore the sidelong glances and whispers. When I leaned down to read the name card on my chair, it felt like someone had punched the air out of my lungs. Undereducated fake dad. I stared at it, blinking, hoping it would change if I looked long enough. But it didn't. The letters were stark, deliberate, cruel. The laughter started softly. A giggle here, a snicker there, then it grew ugly, mean. Judith had her hand over her mouth, but she couldn't hide the gleam in her eyes. Dr. Whitmore shook his head with false sympathy. I wanted to disappear, to sink through the marble floor and never show my face again. But before I could move, before the humiliation could crush me completely, Mason's voice cut through the noise. "Dad!" I turned. He was standing at the altar, halfway down the aisle towards me, his eyes blazing. "Let's go home." Without hesitation, he crossed the room, took my arm, and together we walked out, past the whispers, past the gasps, past the perfect people in their perfect clothes with their perfect lives. Claire didn't follow. Judith didn't shout. Dr. Whitmore didn't move. They let us go, like we were unworthy. Outside, the sun was blinding. Mason opened the car door for me, just like he had hundreds of times when he was a little boy pretending to be a chauffeur. I slid into the passenger seat, my heart too full to speak. He drove in silence for a while, his hands gripping the steering wheel tight. "I'm sorry, Dad," he said finally, his voice rough. I should have seen it. I shook my head. "You saw it when it mattered." At a red light, he turned to me. "I don't care about degrees or bank accounts or any of that crap. You're my father. You're my family." Tears stung my eyes, but I held them back. That day, I understood something important. Family wasn't built in ballrooms or cemented with diplomas. It was built in the trenches. One scraped knee, one missed meal, one whispered bedtime story at a time. Let them keep their chandeliers and their champagne. I had something they would never understand. I had my son's loyalty, and nothing in the world could make me richer than that. The morning after Mason's non-wedding, I woke up before the sun. Couldn't sleep, no matter how tired I was. My mind kept replaying everything from the night before, the snide laughter, that awful name card, the heavy silence as we walked out of the ballroom. I sat on the porch with a mug of lukewarm coffee, watching the gray light of dawn creep over the horizon. The world was still turning. Somewhere down the street, birds were singing. People were waking up and starting their ordinary lives. But for me, something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't angry. Not really. I was past anger. What I felt now was something deeper, heavier. A sadness for how cruel people could twist something as beautiful as love. I wondered what would happen next. Mason hadn't said much after we got home the night before, just sat on the couch for a long time, staring into space. He finally fell asleep sitting up, his head leaning against the wall, just like he used to as a kid when he'd doze off in the back seat after a long day. I didn't wake him. I just covered him with a blanket and sat beside him, watching over him, the way I always had. I was on my second cup of coffee when I heard the rumble of a car pulling up. I squinted at the driveway and saw Mason's old pickup truck. A little beat up, a little dusty. It was Theo, his best friend from high school. Theo hopped out, still in his mechanic's uniform, and jogged up to the porch. "You seen the news?" he asked, breathless like he'd run the whole way. I frowned. "News?" Theo shoved his phone in my face. The screen was already blazing with headlines. "Whit?" I stared at it, unblinking. Underneath the headline was a picture of Claire's father, Dr. Whitmore, looking grim, surrounded by a throng of reporters. Another headline flashed below. "Sources claim family fortune in jeopardy amidst allegations." My first reaction wasn't joy, not even satisfaction. It was shock. Theo kept talking, excitement bubbling over. "Someone dumped a whole load of documents last night. Emails, bank statements, internal memos, it's everywhere. The SEC is all over it. They're saying Whitmore Industries has been cooking the books for years." I slowly lowered the phone. My heart was pounding, but there was a strange calm settling over me. Was this karma? Was this justice? I didn't know. All I knew was that the very people who had laughed at me, who had called me a fake, who had tried to make me feel like nothing, were crumbling under the weight of their own lies. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Mason standing in the doorway, his hair sticking up every which way, a blanket still draped over his shoulders. "What's going on?" he mumbled. I exchanged a look with Theo, then held out the phone to Mason. He read the headlines, his eyes widening with each word. For a long time, he didn't say anything, just stared at the screen like it was written in a foreign language. Then he slowly exhaled and sank onto the porch steps. I don't even know how to feel," he said finally. I sat down beside him. "You don't have to feel anything right now. Just breathe." Theo clapped him on the shoulder. "Better to find out now than later, man." Mason nodded, still staring into the distance. "I almost married into that mess." "You didn't," I said quietly. "You saw the truth when it mattered." The three of us sat there in silence as the sun climbed higher and the world around us began to hum with life. I could hear the neighbors' sprinklers kicking on, someone down the street mowing their lawn. For most people, it was just another Saturday morning. But for us, it felt like the first day of a different kind of life. Around midday, Mason's phone started buzzing non-stop with calls, texts, voicemails. Some were from Claire, some from her parents, some from people who had been at the wedding, desperately trying to find out what we knew, if we had anything to do with the leak. Mason didn't answer a single one. He just sat there, staring at the phone and shaking his head. At one point, he turned to me and said, "Dad, do you think they ever even liked me? Or was it always just about appearances?" I hated that question, hated that he even had to ask it. "I think they liked the idea of you," I said carefully. "The image, the connection. But real love doesn't belittle, doesn't sneer, doesn't care where you come from, or what you wear, or how you make a living. It shows up when you fall, it holds on when things get rough." Mason swallowed hard. "I don't think they ever really saw me." "Their loss," I said simply. As the day wore on, the news for the Whitmores got worse. More documents surfaced, anonymous sources came forward, former employees talked to the press. It was a tidal wave, and no matter how hard they tried to control the narrative, they were drowning. Theo eventually left to get back to work. Mason and I stayed on the porch, watching it all unfold on the old, beat-up laptop he'd set up on the table between us. At one point, we saw a live feed of reporters swarming Dr. Whitmore outside his office. His face was pale, haggard, nothing like the smug man who had smirked at me across the ballroom just a day before. Judith was there too, clutching her pearls like they could save her. Claire was nowhere to be seen in the crowd. Maybe she was hiding. Maybe she was just smart enough to stay away. Mason watched for a few minutes, then closed the laptop with a sigh. "I don't want anything from them," he said. "Not their money, not their apologies, nothing." "You don't need anything from them," I said. "You've got everything you need right here." He looked at me, really looked at me, and for the first time in a long time, I saw a flicker of peace in his eyes. Maybe not happiness yet, but peace. That night, we grilled burgers in the backyard, just the two of us. No fancy food, no white tablecloths, just 2 plates on our laps, ketchup dripping down our fingers, laughter filling the warm summer air. We didn't talk about the Whitmores, didn't talk about the wedding. We just talked about life, about dreams, about the future. Mason told me he was thinking about starting his own business, something simple, something honest. Maybe his own auto repair shop, maybe teaching kids how to fix cars, the way I had taught him. I told him it sounded perfect. As the stars came out overhead, I realized something important. The storm had passed, and even though the world had tried to break us, even though the laughter still echoed faintly in the back of my mind, it didn't matter anymore. We were still standing, still together, still undefeated. The next few days were a blur of phone calls and news reports, but underneath it all, something kept nagging at me, a memory, a secret I had buried so deep, even Mason didn't know about it. It started years ago, after Laura died, around the time I was fighting for custody of Mason. I didn't have much, the old house, an even older pickup truck, a few $1,000s left over from Laura's life insurance. Not enough to live comfortably, not by a long shot, but it was something, and I knew I had to be smart with it. One afternoon, when Mason was still in diapers, I walked into the community center, which offered free financial advice for low-income families. I didn't know anything about stocks or investments, barely understood what a savings account was. But I sat through every seminar, read every dog-eared pamphlet they gave me, and asked 1,000 questions. I wanted to be prepared for whatever life threw our way. That's where I learned about investing small amounts in companies, not the big, flashy scams, but smart, patient investments, a little bit at a time, year after year. And strangely enough, one of the companies I put a small portion of Laura's insurance money into was Whitmore Industries. Back then, they weren't the giant they later became, just another mid-sized manufacturing company. Their stock was cheap, their prospects decent. I figured, why not? It wasn't a fortune, just a few hundred here and there, enough that over the years, as Whitmore Industries grew, so did my small share. I never told anyone about it, not because I was hiding it, but because it just didn't seem important. It was just a quiet thing I did in the background, like fixing a leaky faucet or making sure Mason had enough money for school books. By the time Mason went to college, I had accumulated a surprising number of shares, enough to be considered what they called a minor silent investor. Not enough to sit on their board or have any real influence, but enough that if I sold, someone would notice. I hadn't touched those shares in years. They just sat there, growing quietly, like a tree planted in a forgotten field. Until that night at the wedding. When I saw that name card, when I heard the laughter, something inside me snapped. Not out of anger, not out of revenge, but out of clarity. The people who sat there and sneered at me thought I was nothing. They didn't know I owned a small piece of the empire they were so proud of. They didn't know that with one phone call, I could rock their comfortable little world. So that's what I did. I waited until Mason and I were back home, until he was asleep on the couch, a blanket tucked up to his chin like he was a little boy again. Then I sat down at the kitchen table, pulled out the old laptop I barely used, and logged into my investment account. There they were, hundreds of shares, enough to make a difference. I didn't hesitate. I clicked sell. I didn't just sell them on the open market. I directed them to a competitor I had researched months before, a company that had been waiting for the right moment to strike. The transfer went through in less than 20 minutes. By morning, it would all be done, and I would be free of them. I didn't do it to destroy them, not really. That wasn't even my first thought. I did it because I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my silence, not my respect, not my investment in their future. They had already decided what I was worth. They forgot to check who held a small piece of their house. The crash started the next morning. News outlets were quick to sniff out the sale. Rumors spread. People panicked. The stock plummeted. Investigations began, stirring up the dirt the Whitmores had been sweeping under their expensive rugs for years. It was chaos. Beautiful, ugly chaos. And through it all, I stayed silent. Mason didn't know. Nobody knew. It was my quiet goodbye to people who had never deserved a hello. I watched it all unfold with a strange sense of calm. No gloating, no triumphant fist pump. Just the same steady feeling I got after finishing a tough engine repair. The satisfaction of a job done, of the gears finally turning the way they were supposed to. One evening, a few days after the crash started, Mason and I were sitting on the porch again. We didn't talk much about the Whitmores anymore. It was like we both silently agreed to leave the past where it belonged. But that night, Mason turned to me, a frown creasing his brow. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "What happened to them?" I thought about it for a long moment. "No," I said finally, "because what they built was hollow. It was built on lies, on hurting people who were weaker than them. It was always going to fall. They just didn't think it would happen so soon." Mason nodded, looking out at the stars. "Do you think Claire knew?" he asked after a while. I shrugged. "Maybe she did. Maybe she didn't. Doesn't change anything." He sat quietly, his shoulders slumped like he was carrying something heavy. I reached over and clapped him on the back. "You don't owe them anything, Mason," I said. "Not your guilt, not your regret. Sometimes, when a house catches fire, your job isn't to run back inside." He took a shaky breath. I wanted it to be real. The love, the family, all of it." "I know, son," I said softly. "And it will be someday, with someone who doesn't need to measure your worth before they decide to love you." We sat there in silence after that. A comfortable silence, the kind that settles between two rocks in a river, worn smooth but unyielding. The old clock ticked inside the house. The world turned. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like we were exactly where we were supposed to be. A week later, I officially closed my investment account, selling off all the other small stocks I'd accumulated over the years. I didn't need them anymore, didn't need the security blanket. We had something better. We had each other, and we had our freedom. Sometimes the quietest hands shape the world the most, the ones nobody notices. The ones the rich and powerful laugh at, ignore, or forget, until those hands quietly let go, and everything they thought was solid starts to crumble. I didn't need their approval. I didn't need their apology. I didn't even need them to know it was me. The only thing I needed was already sitting beside me on that porch, a son who chose me, and a life that no amount of money could ever replace. Life has a funny way of surprising you when you least expect it. After everything that happened, the wedding debacle, the Whitmore Industries implosion, the endless stream of news articles painting Claire's family in a new, uglier light, I thought Mason would be broken for a long time. Thought he'd retreat into himself, become hard and bitter like some men do after betrayal. But Mason wasn't raised that way. Slowly, like the first stubborn shoots pushing through frozen ground, he started to heal. It began with small things. He started getting up early again, fixing things around the house without being asked, changing the oil in the truck, repainting the porch railing. Little tasks that might seem meaningless to someone else, but to me, they meant the world. They meant he was choosing life over anger, movement over bitterness. One morning, I found him sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of notebooks and his laptop spread out in front of him. "What's all this?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of coffee. He looked up, his eyes brighter than I'd seen them in weeks. "I'm thinking about opening my own auto shop, Dad." I blinked. "Your own place?" He nodded. "Not just repairs, but teaching too." Classes for high school kids who want to learn a trade, apprenticeships, real work with real skills. Pride swelled in my chest so fast it almost knocked me off my feet. "That's a damn good idea, son," I said, grinning so wide my cheeks hurt. He smiled back, a little sheepishly. "Guess it's time I started building something real, something that matters." The next few weeks, Mason was consumed with planning. He found an old building on the edge of town, a run-down auto garage with broken windows and a leaky roof. It was a mess, but it had good bones, just like Mason, strong, reliable, built to last. I helped him every step of the way. We patched drywall, replaced broken tiles, scrubbed away years of dust and grime. Sometimes we worked until midnight, covered in paint and sweat, laughing about how sore we were going to be in the morning. But there was a joy in that work, a kind of sacred satisfaction that money couldn't buy. And somewhere along the way, something even better happened. Mason met Leah. It wasn't some grand cinematic moment with fireworks and slow motion running through a field. It was simpler, realer. She worked at the hardware store where Mason and I had been going what felt like 100 times a week. A small woman with big brown eyes, calloused hands from working the aisles, no makeup, no pretense, just a bright laugh and a way of talking that made you feel like you mattered. I saw it happening almost in slow motion. One afternoon, Mason was arguing with a clerk about the difference between two brands of sealant when Leah stepped in. She patiently explained the nuances and gave Mason a smile that turned him into a stammering fool. He didn't stop talking about her that night. "She's smart, Dad," he said, practically glowing. "She knows more about tools than I do." I just smiled and said, "Looks like you finally found your match." It didn't take long. Coffee dates turned into dinners, dinners into long walks in the park, long walks into nights where Mason came home humming to himself like he had a new song in his heart. A month later, he brought her over for dinner. I grilled my famous burgers, and we ate in the backyard under the stars. Leah fit right in, laughing at our terrible jokes, teasing Mason about still not being able to tell the difference between a Phillips and a flathead screwdriver. But the thing that struck me the most was the way she looked at him. Not like he was a project, not like he was a stepping stone to something better. She looked at him like he was already enough. And for a man who had spent too many months questioning his worth, that look meant everything. Later that night, after Leah had left and Mason and I were cleaning up, he turned to me, shy and serious. "I think she's the one, Dad." I clapped him on the shoulder. "You'll know when it's right. You'll know." And he did. 3 months later, Mason proposed. No grand gestures, no flash mobs or choreographed dances. Just a quiet evening in the small shop he was still renovating. He got down on one dusty knee with a simple ring and a heart full of hope. Leah said yes before he even finished the question. The wedding was small. In our backyard, under the old oak tree Mason used to climb as a kid. Close friends, a few neighbors, Theo as the best man. No fancy name cards, no marble halls. Nobody cared about degrees or income brackets. All that mattered was the laughter that filled the air and the tears that filled my eyes as I watched my son marry a woman who saw him for who he was, and nobody else. When they exchanged vows, Mason didn't talk about wealth or appearances. He talked about loyalty, about late nights spent fixing broken things, about a love built on hard work, patience, and stubborn hope. When it was over, and Mason and Leah were dancing barefoot on the grass, I leaned back in a lawn chair with a cold beer in my hand and felt a peace deeper than I had ever known. We had come full circle. From a courtroom where I fought for my son, to a ballroom where they tried to belittle me, to a backyard where real love finally stood tall and proud. Later that night, Mason found me sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars. He sat down beside me, still in his wedding suit, his tie loosened, his hair a little messy from dancing. "Thanks for everything, Dad," he said quietly. "You did this, son," I replied, You built this life, you chose it. He shook his head. I wouldn't have known how to choose it if you hadn't shown me first. We sat in comfortable silence for a long time, the night wrapping around us like a blanket. And I understood something. The battles I had fought, the humiliations I had endured, the sacrifices I had made, the loneliness I had carried, it had all been worth it. Every scraped knuckle, every sleepless night, every whispered prayer when I didn't know how we were going to make it. Because it had all led to this, to a son who knew what real love was, and a life richer than any fortune. Sometimes in the evenings, I sit on the porch with a cold drink in my hand, watching the sunset paint the sky. I rock slowly in my old chair, the wood creaking beneath me, and I think about the life I built, not out of bricks or blueprints, but with hands that stayed steady when the storms came. I watch through the open window as Mason moves around inside the house he and Leah have made their own. Their twins, Lily and Jack, are tumbling across the living room floor, a blur of laughter and tiny socks. Leah chases after them, her own laughter bubbling up, and Mason pretends to be a growling bear, crawling after them on all fours. Their house is simple, like mine always was. No grand chandeliers, no marble floors. Just a place built with love, passed down with patience, and filled with a kind of real laughter that hums in your bones. Every now and then, Mason will glance out the window at me, grin, and give me a wave. I wave back, feeling something settle deep inside me, something stronger than pride, deeper than satisfaction, peace. Years ago, when Claire's family tried to shame me at that wedding, I thought maybe they had stolen something from me. Maybe they had left a scar that would never heal. But now, watching the life Mason and Leah have built, I understand the truth. They didn't steal anything. They only revealed what was always strong. Family isn't measured by titles or wealth or diplomas hanging on a wall. It's measured by who shows up, who stays, who loves you when it isn't fashionable. It's measured by scraped knees that get kissed, broken hearts that get mended with patience, old pickup trucks that keep running longer than they should. It's measured by two tired hands that built a life out of nothing but grit and a whole lot of stubborn hope. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the evening breeze touch my face. I think of Laura, of the promises we made when we were young and foolish and thought we had forever. I like to believe she's still watching from somewhere beyond the clouds, smiling at the life we carved out of loss and hard days. I imagine her sitting beside me now, her quiet laugh in the air, her hand reaching out to squeeze mine. You both did good. Sometimes after the kids are asleep, Mason will come out with 2 beers. He'll sit beside me, stretching out his long legs, and we'll talk about nothing and everything. About how Jack thinks he's a dinosaur, about how Lily refuses to go to sleep unless she hears 3 bedtime stories in a row, about how terrifying it is to raise kids, to wonder if you're doing it right, to be afraid of making mistakes you can't even see yet. Sometimes I'm scared, Dad, he admitted once, looking up at the stars. Scared of messing it all up. I chuckled softly, taking a slow sip of my drink. Welcome to parenthood, I said. He laughed, shaking his head. It looked easy when you did it. I turned to look at him, at the strong, good man he had become. It wasn't easy, I said. Not for a single minute. I just loved you enough to keep going. That's the secret nobody tells you. About family, about life. It's not about getting it all right. It's not about never falling down. It's about getting back up every single time. About being there, even when you're tired, even when you're scared, even when you have no damn clue what you're doing. It's about loving so hard that all the broken pieces start to fit together in a new way. And sitting there beside my son under the starry sky, I understood something else. The Whitmores had laughed at me once, called me an undereducated fake dad, tried to make me feel like nothing. But none of that mattered anymore. Because while their empire crumbled, while their carefully constructed lives fell apart in newspaper headlines and courtrooms, My life was right here, alive and breathing and growing stronger every day. Not perfect, not polished, but real. Mason built his auto shop from the ground up. It's a small place with grease-stained floors and a huge hand-painted sign that reads, Cooper's Garage, honest work, honest people. Every day after school, high school kids come by to learn how to fix engines, change oil, patch tires. Mason teaches them with the same patience I tried to teach him. Leah runs the office, often with the twins on her hips, somehow managing to balance the books and order parts with a kid on each arm. Sometimes, when I stop by, the kids call me Mr. Cooper or Coach, and ask me to show them tricks with old carburetors. I teach them everything I know, just like I taught Mason. Watching their grins and grease-smudged faces, I realized that somehow, without even planning it, we had built something more than just a life. We had built a legacy, a place where kids who felt overlooked could find pride in their hands, in their skills, in knowing they mattered. And Mason stands right in the middle of it all. Not because of a fancy name, not because of a silver spoon, but because he knows what real worth is, because he grew up knowing it. One evening, after a long day at the shop, Mason found me on the porch again. He sat down beside me without a word, handing me a cold beer, and stared out at the field stretching under the moonlight. After a while, he spoke. "Thanks for fighting for me, Dad. For everything." I clinked my bottle against his and said, "Always." Because that's what real fathers do. They show up, they stay, they love, even when it's hard, when it's messy, when the world tells them they're not enough. They prove the world wrong, not with speeches or money or shiny things, but with the simple, stubborn act of being there. And tonight, as I sit here rocking under the wide open sky, I know that no matter what the world tried to say about me, I was never a fake father. I was never low, anything. I was a real man, a real father, and I had built a life that no laughter, no cruelty, no nameplate could ever erase.